Kelsey. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats. And today I'm bringing you a wrap-up for the final two readathons that I participated in the month of June. These were the Getting Graphic readathon and the Because Dragons readathon. The Because Dragons readathon ran from July 13th through 19th and was hosted from Jordan from Call Me Sensei. And the Getting Graphic readathon was one day only, and that was all day on June 17th, and it was hosted by Caitlin from Kitty G and Elena from Elena Reads Books. I'll leave the information for both of those down below so you can keep in touch for when those readathons are happening again. Both readathons had sets of challenges, but because they overlapped, the one day for the Getting Graphic readathon happened during the period of the Because Dragons readathon, I overlapped books for those challenges. And due to the nature of the Getting Graphic readathon, most of the books I have to show you here are for that readathon numerically because they're a lot shorter and I got through a bunch of them in one day. And then the longer books, I have a couple of them that fulfilled the challenges that I didn't get through with the Getting Graphic readathon. So I'm going to show you what I read for Getting Graphic, then I'm going to tell you what challenges they fulfilled for each readathon, and then I'm going to show you the other things that I also read for the Because Dragons readathon. So the first thing I read for the Getting Graphic readathon was The Girl from the Other Side, Volume 2 by Nagabe. This is a manga series that I picked up sort of on a whim because it looked really cool. I've not read manga before, but I've been really liking this. I know that this probably isn't a particularly typical manga series to start with, but it's working for me. The art is sort of beautiful and dark and eerie, and it has a bit of a whimsical fairy tale feel. It's about this little girl named Shiva who lives in the woods with this dapper monster whom she calls Teacher. This is a world that's divided into the inside where the humans live and the outside where the outsiders like this guy live. It's believed that the outsiders are cursed and that the curse spreads by touch. And there seems to be a lot of fear and paranoia, and there's a lot of mystery that's still to be uncovered in this series, in this story. These are very small, they're very quick to read. I'd say Volume 2 has a little less of the sort of sugary sweet adorableness that Volume 1 had. There's still enough of it there to please me. It was a little creepier, a little more haunting, but not too much for me. I still really like this series, and I gave this one 4 stars, which is the same rating that I gave the first one. Next, I read Baba Yaga's Assistant by Marika McCoola, illustrated by Emily Carroll. I'd say this is like a middle grade aged graphic novel standalone about a girl named Masha. Her mother died some time ago. Her father has been not spending a lot of time with her. She learns that her father intends to remarry. There's a big scene that goes down with the girl who's supposed to be her new stepsister. She runs into the woods and decides she's going to try to become Baba Yaga's assistant, Baba Yaga being the creepy old witch from Russian fairy tales who lives in a hut on chicken legs. Baba Yaga sets a series of tasks for her to test if she is qualified to be an assistant, and she has to meet those magical tasks. The art in this is nice, but it's not really my style of graphic novel art. I appreciated that the style of the art actually changes in several scenes that are like flashbacks to different Russian fairy tales or things that happened in the past. We get this backstory with Masha's grandmother, who apparently also knew Baba Yaga as a child. And while this was fun and I enjoyed it, the art wasn't quite my cup of tea, and there were some things as an adult reader that I would have wanted a little better developed than you get in a book like this. Specifically, Masha's broken relationship with her father I don't think got as much focus, as much development as I would have wanted for the sort of happy ending that this gets. The happy ending is sort of resolved between Masha and the spiteful little kid, when it seemed to me like the real family problem here from an adult point of view is that Masha's father hasn't been spending time with her, and he doesn't even tell her that he's seeing this other woman until he announces that they're going to be married. But I liked the fantasy stuff with Baba Yaga, and I liked the flashbacks that were about Masha's grandmother. So overall, this was good, but not great. It was a 3-star rating for me. I think if you have kids, I would strongly recommend this if they like, you know, fairy tale fantasy graphic novel stuff. Next, I have March Book 1 by John Lewis, Andrew Aydin, and Nate Powell. In case you're unaware, John Lewis is a United States congressman who was an activist during the civil rights movement, and he's considered something of a civil rights hero here in the United States if you're watching from elsewhere. And this series, March, is autobiographical. It's the story of his involvement in the civil rights movement. This starts out with a bit of a framing device. It starts out on the day of President Obama's inauguration, and Congressman John Lewis is preparing to go to the inauguration, and a mother and her son come by his office, and he starts to tell them a little bit about his own history from when he was a kid, and this follows his childhood growing up on a farm to the point when he goes to college and becomes involved in some activism, with mentions of some of the other major historical events in the civil rights timeline that readers are probably familiar with, so you can piece everything together. And the culmination of this volume is the success of sit-in protests at lunch counters that Lewis participated in. So this reads a little bit like a history lesson. It is. And there are also times when it's clearly meaning to instruct the reader a bit on the principles of nonviolent protest, which is also really interesting. I think this is really good if you want to revisit this history. It's a period of history that everyone in the United States, I think, learns about at some point in school, and then maybe we don't necessarily revisit it as often as we need to in order to remember that this is what happened and not that long ago in our history. The art is this black and white style that I didn't think was going to be particularly appealing to me, but I think it really works for the story that this is telling, and I gave this 4 stars. Next, I read Descender Volume 3, Singularities by Jeff Lemire and Dustin Nguyen. This is, of course, the sci-fi series known for its beautiful watercolor art. I actually have always found the sort of juxtaposition of the watercolor style with some of the horrible violent happenings and the desolate world of this series to be unsettling in an interesting way. But in Volume 3 we get some individual character backstories. It's not that the main plot doesn't progress at all. Each of these characters and character groups are in like different places, having different things happen to them at the end of Volume 2. And so in Volume 3 we get a little bit into the backstory of each of a number of different characters, and then it bridges the gap to now and we see things move forward just ever so slightly. And it worked for me. I'm still not madly in love with this series. This is a graphic novel series that I'm kind of just continuing to read because I started it and now I kind of want to know what happens. This is a consistent 3-star read series for me, and this continued that trend. I forgot to mention what the series is about. The series is about a little robot boy named Tim21 in a world that is hostile to AIs. He's being chased down by everyone and everything because of a possible connection between his programming and the giant robots called harvesters that destroyed a whole ton of everything. The next thing I read was another kids graphic novel, and that's Hilda and the Troll by Luke Pearson. This took me by surprise. This has really great reviews on Goodreads, which is kind of why I picked it up. But I was not expecting to be as thoroughly charmed by this as I was. This is so whimsical, so sweet, and it's just like absolutely cute and hilarious and adorable. It's about this little girl named Hilda who lives, there's a map, here that's her house, and then this is where she goes roaming on her adventures. In this book, predictably, she heads off and discovers a troll. It's very short, so not much actually happens, so I can't tell you much about the plot without telling you like everything about the plot. But what I just want you to know is how thoroughly charming it is. Like here, just on the very first page, like this wood guy inexplicably walks into the house and just like lays down by the fire. And you hear her mom saying, "Oh, look, you've gone and let the woodman in again." And I particularly love this little bit also right at the beginning where Hilda's camping out in a tent in the rain. And she says, "Nothing makes you appreciate the feeling of being snug more. When your protection is canvas thin, a million assaults on my coziness, thwarted noisily every time." It is just like the most charming, eccentric, whimsical, cute thing ever. This is a series. There are more of these. I want to read more of these. And then the last book I read for the Getting Graphic readathon was both the largest. I read it in like the last 2 hours of the night before midnight, and I finished it like just before the stroke of midnight. And I was so glad I did because it also ended up being my favorite. And that is The 100 Nights of Hero by Isabel Greenberg. This is the same author who did the Encyclopedia of Early Earth, which I also want to read. I just haven't been able to get my hands on it yet. And this does take place in the same world as Early Earth. It takes place in Early Earth, the same world as the Encyclopedia of Early Earth. But you can read this as a standalone. I've seen this described as being sort of the darker, angrier counterpart to that book, which was sort of lighter and fluffier. I haven't read the Encyclopedia of Early Earth, so I don't know if that's true, but it makes sense to me from what I know about that book and having read this one. So this obviously speaks to me because it's a fairy tale-esque stories within stories premise, which is one of my absolute fictional weaknesses. This is sort of riffing on the structure of the 1001 Nights with the 100 Nights of Hero. The premise is slightly different though. Instead of having a murderous king who believes that women cannot be faithful and cuts off their heads every morning, we have a couple of idiot men making a wager on whether the wife of one of them will be faithful if the other goes to try to seduce her for 100 nights. Unbeknownst to the husband, his wife, Chee, this one here, is actually in love with her maid, Hero. And Hero, we learn, belongs to a society of secret storytellers, and she spends the 100 nights entertaining this guy with her amazing, fabulous stories to keep him from forcing himself upon Chee. Some of the stories in this I actually recognized as retellings of things, and some of them I didn't, so that makes me wonder if maybe all of them might be retellings and some of them are just retellings of things I don't recognize. One of them I recognized as a retelling of an obscure fairy tale that I only recognized because I had read a different retelling of it. There's another one that I found out from information on her website is actually a retelling of a folk song of some sort. And then towards the end, there's a really good 12 Dancing Princesses retelling. The thing with me and 12 Dancing Princesses is that I always feel that there should be better retellings of it than the ones I've read. I always feel that it's a bummer that for a story with so many princesses in it, it's sort of the ultimate win half the kingdom and my daughter's hand in marriage type of story. And I think this gave it a twist ending that was, you know, dark and not a happy ending, but it sort of satisfied my hunger for someone to address that big hulking problem with that story straight on. And as with all really good stories within stories books, for me at least, all of the stories eventually contribute to the story of Chee and Hero, and it all comes together beautifully. Isabel Greenberg's art uses this really minimal, stark color palette that is very effectively used. And this is actually a really text-heavy graphic novel. You can see that there's, you know, narrative chunks between the images, and it's really like beautiful lyrical fairy tale writing of the sort that I really, really like. So I absolutely adored The 100 Nights of Hero, and I gave it 5 stars. For comparison, it reminded me a little bit of Catherine M. Valente's Orphan's Tales books, and those are also stories within stories told at night, but beyond that, there's a similarity in the sort of dark, angry tone and in the themes of injustices in a harsh world. So yes, dark feminist fairy tale stuff for grown-ups. I like it very much. So this was what I read for the Getting Graphic Readathon. That was 6 books. I was really pleased with myself. So there were challenges for the Getting Graphic Readathon. I'm going to read out the challenges now and tell you which of those books met which of the challenges. The first was to try a new series. 2 of these qualified for that, March and Hilda and the Troll. I forgot to mention, I was negligent in forgetting to mention, Hilda and the Troll was, I think, originally published as Hildafolk. I think the series is sometimes referred to as Hildafolk, but if you see a book with this same cover that's called Hildafolk, it's the same book. Number 2 is to finish a series or to catch up to the point at which it had been published. So 2 of these qualified for that. The Girl from the Other Side, only 2 volumes of this are out so far. This is volume 2. And Descender, Volume 3. Volume 4 has since come out. It was released at the end of the month at some point, towards the end of June. But at the time I was reading this was the last published volume of Descender. Number 3 is to read a non-fiction graphic novel. For me, that was March. Number 4 was to try a new genre or format. This is the one that I'm stretching a little bit, but I think this counts. For me, I'm going to count an age group for this. I had not read children's or middle grade graphic novels before. I think part of me had said, oh, that's too easy a reading level for me. If I'm reading graphic novels, I need to be reading at least YA. I'm a grown-up. But the reality is that a lot of graphic novels that are published for grown-ups are like too violent and graphic for me in like violent and disturbing ways, and I much prefer like the sort of fairy tale whimsical stuff that you're more likely to find in things for younger readers. So I just went for the kids' books with these 2. Strangely, I was expecting to like Baba Yaga's Assistant more than Hilda and the Troll because it was longer and more substantial, but Hilda and the Troll surprised me. I thought this was absolutely like the most delightful thing ever. And number 5 was to read something with black and white art. Both The Girl from the Other Side and March had black and white art. So the only one of the ones that I read that didn't fulfill any of the challenges was The 100 Nights of Hero. And I already told you how pleased I am to have read this. There are no regrets here whatsoever. I love it so much. I'm not sure I mentioned it before. I'll mention it now. I've not read a ton of graphic novels. It's something I've only started to get into at all in the last year or so, only since I've started BookTube. And so I was using the Getting Graphic Readathon to just like place holds on lots of things and, you know, buy some things because I bought this that I, you know, wouldn't have previously considered buying, and just to try to read a bunch of things in hope that I would find something I really liked, because I have been struggling to find graphic novels that I will really like. And this was my first 5-star graphic novel read ever in my life. I am so happy. Now on to what the challenges for the Because Dragons Readathon were. So the Because Dragons Readathon was focused entirely on fantasy books. So I'm going to remove anything from this stack that wasn't fantasy. March is nonfiction and Descender is science fiction. Goodbye. So the rest of what remains I can consider to be crossover books for the Because Dragons Readathon. So number 1, a fantasy book with white on the cover. I started The Ill-Made Knight for this and didn't get through it by the end of the readathon, but for white any amount, either of these will work. Shiva is in white here. Baba Yaga has white hair. There are a couple other things that I read that I can argue for. There's a little bit of white on the 100 Nights of Hero. There's a little bit of white on everything. 2, a fantasy book with an LGBT plus main character. And for that, actually, The 100 Nights of Hero does count. I also read another book that I could count for this, but I'll get to that later. Number 3 was listen to a fantasy audiobook, so I'm going to share with you what the book that I read was for that in a little bit. And then number 4 was to read a fantasy book with fire on the cover or in the title. That was the other one that I read a different book for. And then 5 was a fantasy book that features mythological creatures. So there is no way in which Hilda and the Troll does not count for this. Trolls are definitely mythological creatures, and there are trolls in this book. At least one troll. And depending on how you want to count it, you could probably count the girl from the other side too. The outsiders aren't mythological creatures that exist in a pre-existing mythology that I'm aware of. I think they're just created for this series, but I think you could still fudge it. I don't need to fudge it though, because I read a book about trolls. So my fantasy audiobook that I read was The Reader by Traci Chee. I listened to this on audiobook CD that I imported into iTunes and then put on my iPhone. This is a young adult fantasy novel that is meant to be the first in a series called The Sea of Ink and Gold. I think it's going to be a trilogy. I think the second book is coming out soon, if it's not already out soon. This was narrated by Kim, my guest. I thought the narration was really good. This is about a girl named Safiya, and at the beginning of this book, she lives with her Aunt Nguyen, who's not actually her aunt, that's just what she calls her. And they survive traveling on their own by hunting and trading and also stealing. Safiya is an orphan. We eventually learn what happened to her parents. And one day her Aunt Nguyen is captured and taken by mysterious people who are looking for something that they have. And Safiya has this something that belonged to her parents, and it is a book. Now, this is a world in which the people are illiterate and books are completely unheard of, except by an elite magical order who are the only people who know about books and about reading. Reading in this world is an inherently magical act, it seems. The whole magic system is sort of formulated around reading in this book, both the ability to read text and to read other things, like the ability to look at an object and read its history. So it's all about knowledge of the history and of the past and of the future. And so it's sort of a book lover's dream magic system in a way. And the title of the series, The Sea of Ink and Gold, is a reference to how this magic system is talked about in this book, and it's really lovely. But Safiya starts out knowing none of this. She has no idea what this thing is that's a legacy of her parents. She has no idea what it does, why her parents had it, and eventually she discovers what the book is and how to read it. But she's on her own and on the run, and she has to figure out how the book works, and why it's important, why her parents had it, and she's also trying to see if she can rescue her Aunt Nguyen. Along the way, she rescues a boy who has been enslaved, ensorcelled. I'm not entirely clear on whether what the impressors are doing with these kids they capture is magical in any way or not. That was one of the things that I was unclear about. Nevertheless, Safiya thinks that there may be some connection between what these people are doing and her book, so she ends up freeing this boy. So of course there can be a romance that starts to happen, of course, as they head off together through the woods and out to sea to try to uncover this massive web of magic and secrets. There are also 2 secondary plot lines that get far less time than the main plot line, and they take a long time for each of them to figure out how they connect to the main plotline. One of them is about a boy who becomes an apprentice librarian at this magical institution. The other is about some pirates on the high seas. So if you like a good, pirate subplot, this has a charming pirate subplot. I must confess though, even at the end of book 1, I'm still not 100% certain how or why the pirates really needed to be part of this story. The storylines do connect. I almost enjoyed the portions that were just like tales of pirate adventure more than I enjoyed the rest of the book. I thought that it was a really beautifully written subplot. The themes running through it have to do with what do you do in this lifetime to be remembered so that you can live on after you die. And the writing in this book is really lyrical, and I really enjoyed that. This is dense enough writing that I almost regret listening to it on audiobook, even though I don't think I would have picked up this book at all had I not found this audiobook CD for $1 at a used bookstore. I really like listening to audiobooks where the narrators are giving really good performances. That's something I really enjoy. But I try not to listen to books that are too dense on audio because I know that I have a harder time absorbing the details of a story when I'm listening to it as opposed to when I'm reading it. My reading comprehension, if you will, is just not as strong on audio as it is in print. I have to really focus on not letting my mind wander from what I'm listening to, and then when it does, I'm never quite sure how much I missed. I'm not one of those people who can listen to an audiobook while doing other things. If my attention is divided like that at all, I miss things in the book. So I really liked the lyrical writing in this book, and I really liked the narrator, but it's just dense enough that I feel like I may have missed some of the finer points. So all that said, I've told you what I really liked about this book. Now, the reason that I gave it only a 3-star rating was that I just found the main storyline, Sephia's storyline, Sephia and the boy Archer, to be just really ho-hum, middle-of-the-road, young adult fantasy stuff. There was nothing in that felt like I hadn't read it before in other young adult books, and I just wasn't that invested in them or in the main intrigue, plot, storyline that it seems to be where this series is headed as a whole. So I'm not sure whether I will continue with this series or not. I'll probably wait until some reviews of the second book come out and make my decision then. I will say this was a rather long book to listen to on audio. This was 12.5 hours. This is like a 440-page book in print. And then the last challenge I had left to fulfill for the Because Dragons readathon was to read a book with fire on the cover or in the title, and for this I read What Is Not Yours Is Not Yours, which is a short story collection by Helen Oyeyemi. You may remember in my TBR I was a little cautious about putting this on a fantasy TBR because I wasn't sure to what extent this would actually qualify as fantasy. I was expecting it to be more on the magical realism or literary fiction side of things. I'd say that's true in terms of how it reads as a genre and in terms of the style of the writing, but there were definitely enough fantastical elements, at least in some of these stories, that I have no qualms about including it in this readathon. I got to a story with like a friendly ghost and sentient puppets, one of whom was a point of view character, and I was like, okay, this can be fantasy. I will count this as fantasy. Not all of the stories in this book are overtly fantastical to that degree. I would say that 2 stories, I think, are that fantastical. There was the one with the sentient puppets, and there was the one that was a really bizarre Little Red Riding Hood thing. And then there were a couple that didn't strike me as particularly magical at all, although they may have had crossover characters from some of the other stories. And then the rest were sort of in between. So as I mentioned, these are stories where in some of them, characters from previous stories will pop up as minor characters in other stories. So a lot of them are interconnected. I think there were 1 or 2 that I didn't notice being connected to any of the others in any particular way. But then the other thing that runs through the collection is that all of them at some point, somehow, in some way, involve a key or keys and locks. And in some of them, this is a big part of the story, and in some of them, it's not a big part of the story at all. It just happens to be there, and you notice it because all of the stories have keys and locks in them. So this isn't a short story collection where I think the stories stand on their own. It's a short story collection that I think really does need to be read as a collection. That said, there are no big aha moments. There aren't any real strong themes that I feel were being hit home. It's definitely a more atmospheric collection of stories, where each of the stories kind of just creates a mood more than anything else. Like the keys, I'm not sure there was really a strong point to it, except for a sort of like wishy-washy stream of conscience, what do keys make you think of in this context type thing. So in terms of like literary analysis, I'm really not sure what to make of it. This was my first experience with Helen Oyeyemi, and I know there are people who think her writing is just absolutely brilliant. And I do see where they're getting that. I really like the style of the writing. I do like those moods that she creates, and sometimes she'd have a way of saying something or come up with a phrase or a sentence that I thought was just absolutely charming and delightful, and I thought, yes, this is totally my thing, but it never really coalesced into anything particularly memorable for me. And I've seen reviews for this book on Goodreads and maybe elsewhere where people have said, oh, this must just be too smart for me because I'm not getting it. And I see why people would think that. It's the kind of writing where you can definitely leap to the assumption that, oh, there must be something here that I'm just not getting. Especially when this author has been so highly praised by so many smart people. And I'm going to take a leap here. I'm going to say that I'm confident enough in my own reading skills that I don't think there was a whole ton here that I wasn't getting. I think this is the sort of writing that's maybe meant to be a little aimless but rich enough that it'll send the reader down their own pathways of thought. That's my take on it. If you've read this short story collection, let me know if that's your take on it too and what you thought of it. Let me know if your take was really different, if you saw something that I'm not seeing. But anyways, this wasn't quite my jam as much as I wanted it to be, so I gave it 3 stars. And I'm not leaving this super enthused to go read more of Helen Oyeyemi's work. I'm going to mention that in addition to having fire on the cover, there are several stories in this book that have queer protagonists. Not all of the stories in this book, but some of them, and those protagonists sometimes show up as minor characters in some of the other stories. So I think I could have used this to fulfill that challenge as well, but I didn't need to because I had already read The 100 Nights of Hero. Anyways, that's the end of what I read for the Because Dragons readathon, as well as the Getting Graphic readathon. Let me know if you've read any of these, if you're planning on reading any of these, what you think. Also let me know if you participated in either of these readathons and if you had a favorite book from either of those readathons. Anyhow, I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.